What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Canadian Football Fanatics YouTube channel. And thank you guys for tuning in to another video. Ladies and gentlemen, we have done it. We are in the month of May, and football season is darn near here. It is around the corner, and Blake and I are officially back for a training camp preview. You know that is the start of football season when Blake and I are back talking some BC Lions, and I'm excited to kick it off here today with our training camp preview for the BC Lions. But first, let me get to my main man, as always, joining me to talk some Lions CFL. Blake, thanks for joining us, buddy. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah, it's not darn near here, Cole. It is here. Like I don't know if you I know you follow a lot of the same people, especially Lions staff that I do, but they all made their way up to Kamloops today. Like our boy Nick Kowalski, he was putting on his Instagram story that he arrived today. Parker Hall, Liam, all those guys were there today. So rookie camp I think starts this weekend, goes for a couple days, and then main camp, I believe, is the 11th, which is what, Sunday? So yeah,
Yeah,
rookie camp might honestly start like Thursday or Friday, and then
yeah.
main camp starts on Sunday. So we are less than a week from the starting BC Lions or projected starters, however you want to put it, putting pads on and getting back on the field.
It is a good time of year, Blake. Before we get to some BC Lions, before we get to some Canadian football, though, of course, please be sure to like the video, leave a comment down below, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. We're closing in at 400 subscribers. It'd be awesome to reach that by the kickoff of the season. The Instagram is doing really well right now, Blake. We are up over 2,500 followers over there. So continue to support us on our social media platforms. That'll be the best way to stay up to date and know what's going on from the Canadian Football Fanatics. Blake, some updates you were just mentioning there. I can make it official. By the time folks are listening this, it'll actually be tomorrow of when we're recording this. But
Mhm.
when uploaded, the start of mini camp where all of the first year CFL players as well as the rookies, I believe the quarterbacks are allowed to attend, starts tomorrow, May 7th to 9th. The BC Lions are holding their mini camp, which, like I said, by the time you guys are listening to this, it is today till the 9th. And then, like Blake said, the Veterans Report and training camp officially kicks off May 11th. It'll go to the 18th. The boys will fly to Vancouver Island. They'll play the Calgary Stampeders, and then they will fly back to Kamloops until I believe it's the 29th when they fly
Yeah.
out. Or it'll probably be the day before they play the Edmonton Elks to close out the preseason on the 29th. So I would imagine they probably fly out the day before on the 28th, leave Kamloops, put a bow on training camp, and once they come back from Edmonton, they will go back to their home in Surrey, and the season will be officially on the doorsteps of the Canadian Football League and their fans. So, Blake, that brings us to today's episode, which is a training camp preview. Been excited to record this one for you, Blake, or with you, Blake. Of course, we've been trying to stay as busy as possible with the content, but just with the nature of the off season, there's not a lot of topics to kind of talk about on a
No,
maybe a
exactly.
monthly basis or maybe a every other week kind of thing, and was not trying to get too repetitive with some of our BC Lions coverage. Wanted to wait till training camp kicks off. Blake and I will be coming at you for another prediction show. So Blake and I will predict the schedule for the BC Lions. We'll come back with maybe a stats prediction as well, and then of course we'll be back after the preseason, and we'll kind of officially start to get a preview of the season. Of we'll have a final roster by then, the final 50 guys that are on the roster, so with practice roster guys as well. And of course, Blake, with the nature of football, injuries happen, transactions happen and stuff like that. So the team could look different. There could be some new faces. Who knows what could happen in a month's time. So Blake and I will be back for an official season preview come that time. But Blake, let's get into our episode here tonight. Blake and I are going to cover a few topics, starting with the BC Lions draft, which is, I think, the official signal, Blake, of the season starting.
Yeah.
Once it wraps up, everybody kind of, buckle up. The season is officially around the corner. It is a quick turnaround, especially for those rookies to, they end up getting drafted, having their, fulfill their dreams, and then a week or two later, they're off to their first professional camp, being put to the test, being, jobs on the line essentially, right? There's no guarantee that they come into camp and they're given a roster spot or they're given any, spot on the practice roster. So it's a quick turnaround for the rookies. They're going to take place, like I said, today by the time you guys are listening to this. But first, the BC Lions, as we know, Blake, was talked about quite a bit all offseason, and you and I both reiterated numerous times on multiple shows, multiple platforms. The Lions losing their first round pick obviously is not something to be happy about, or not something to kind of gloss over without paying it some attention, because it was notable, especially going over the cap by the amount they did. Pretty substantial size. They end up losing their first round pick, and we are down the board quite a bit because we end up losing that. I believe the first selection would have been the first selection in the second round. We end up sitting at the 11th pick. 11 picks we have to wait for teams to select, to let players go off the board, and we were lucky enough to have Hayden Harris fall to us at number 11, University of Montana defensive end. Blake, I will take the time to pat myself on the back, because this was I think I was correct for 3 of the predictions that I put out there the day of the draft, morning of the draft. I predicted the first 19 picks. I think I got 2 of them in the first round, and I got, I believe, 1 of them in the second round, excuse me. And the one that I did get correct predicting was Hayden Harris going to the BC Lions at number 11. And I like to fit there with the BC Lions. At number 11, I thought kind of it was, a range for them to go offensive line. I didn't necessarily think that they would go offensive line with some of the players that they picked up this offseason, with David Foucault, some of the guys that they already have in house, with George Una drafting him last year, Andrew Pearson, Tyler Packer, some of the interior guys already, Corey Woodruff, Chris Slugger. So I didn't know if they were going to go with an offensive lineman as high. But when I looked at the defensive line, Blake, as we know, Siona Tama is going to be suspended for the first 6 games of the season. I look opposite of Matthew Betts, and I think, when was Matthew Betts at his peak? It was when he had David Menard opposite him, a Canadian defensive end who was able to, take some of that pressure off of Matthew Betts, of not being, the vocal point of our defensive line, where, opposite teams are game planning for Matthew Betts, sliding their protections to him, paying him extra protection throughout a game. Having that opposite pass rusher, who is not an elite defensive end, but is a very productive defensive end opposite of Matthew Betts, who, if you don't, pay him some attention, he's going to get home every once in a while. And that was what David Menard was that year. I thought going after a defensive lineman early in the draft would create that same production, or that same kind of effect, I guess, for Matthew Betts, where he was able to have in that 2022 season. I thought about other guys like Jeremiah Ojo, potentially as well, at that number 11 spot. Obviously, he goes off the board. I believe number 7. Hayden Harris is an interesting one, because I know a lot of fans and analysts are a little bit disappointed, I think, with the Lions ultimately going with a futures pick with their first selection of the draft, not having a first round pick, potentially, or more likely wanting to have that first selection be a contributing player in year 1, being on the roster, contributing in some form or fashion. Hayden Harris is signed a undrafted free agent contract with the Buffalo Bills, Blake, as you see me smile, which is cool, obviously. But he is going to get the opportunity to make that roster with the Buffalo Bills, and I would imagine we're not going to see him until the earliest, sometime in the summer. Preseason games for the NFL are, August sometime, where the cuts could start to happen in there, maybe potentially around a Labor Day, or maybe after Labor Day, which, isn't the worst case. In Hayden Harris's case, he's never played Canadian football before. So that is a little bit of a tough one, right? Where he's going to have to come in on the fly, try to learn a new game. I think that's an uphill battle for him. Now, where it might be a beneficial one, right, is he's going to be able to be fresh at that point. You don't have to throw him in right away, because Siona Tama is going to be back from suspension. You can kind of, ease him into the lineup, even have him as a rotational guy behind a guy like Matthew Betts, where Matthew Betts is tired, you kind of have him play some snaps for you. And Hayden Harris, being a guy that's obviously good enough for an undrafted free agent contract, he's a talented player. Ryan Rigbain was quoted as saying that, he was the number 1 player on their board. If they had the first overall pick, they would have selected him with that pick. So the BC Lions are very high on him. I'm also pretty high on him as well, obviously predicting that he would fall to the BC Lions at pick number 11. I'm definitely interested to see whether or not he cracks that Buffalo Bills roster. I think they're pretty loaded at the defensive line position. I look at them already, Blake, being a pretty big Bills fan, as you know. They're already about 10, 11 guys deep in there, and that's kind of what they keep usually every year, or around 10, 11 guys. And they just drafted 3 defensive linemen in this past year's draft that are all going to be giving great get, given greater opportunities because of their draft capital. Now, I will say that the Buffalo Bills were one of the few teams last year. They gave a guy, Joe Andreessen, an opportunity, an undrafted free agent linebacker that came in, earned a roster spot. So they do, they are open to that. They have done it in the past with other guys like Levi Wallace, undrafted free agent guys that come in, earn their opportunity, and can find a spot on the roster. So I'm really interested to see what happens with Hayden Harris and if he's able to come into the BC Lions sometime this summer and make an impact in his rookie year. If not, I feel like this guy is come to the CFL at some point and be an impact for the BC Lions down the road. So, Blake, what were your thoughts when you were, at home watching the draft and you saw the BC Lions select Hayden Harris with their first selection?
Yeah, Hayden Harris is not someone that I know a lot of. There was a few players that, of course, when we did our mock draft with the other 8 representatives or 7 representatives, if you will, of the other 8 CFL teams, um, I don't quite remember where he went, but it was I had like about 5 names that I did um, have on my list, and I think by the time they got to the 11th pick, all 11 or all 5 of those names, pardon me as I stumble on my words, but all 5 of those names, other than Nate Boschman, who went shortly after the BC Lions pick, actually, were already off the board. So I will fully admit I don't know a lot about Hayden Harris. I know a bit more about the Lions' second pick that they had in the second round, the man that they ended up trading up to get. And that just shows how high the BC Lions are on the man that I know you're going to talk about in a second, because they went from the 19th pick, which was, of course, the complimentary pick, if you will, or the correct term is the supplementary pick that they got for playing the second most Canadians snaps behind the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And the Bombers kind of made a splash themselves with their supplementary pick in picking Taylor Elgersma, but they traded up with the Toronto Argonauts to select Jackson Finley.
Yes. So before we get to Jackson Finley, a last few notes on Hayden Harris. As you mentioned, Blake, right? Not a lot of people are familiar with Hayden Harris. Just unfortunately for him, being a NCAA guy as well, his ties to being eligible for the Canadian Football League draft is not what would be the word, I guess, routine, or I don't know if the routine would be the right word, but he's not a traditional Canadian is the word I'm trying to go with his mother being born in Canada, giving him the ability to be eligible for the CFL draft. He was, though, born in Vancouver, BC, from what I understand, raised a little bit in Saskatchewan, has some family still up here in Canada. I believe that the fellows Baker, Nick Wolski were mentioning on First and Now, the BC Lions podcast, that he attended, I believe, Cloverdale Secondary for a little bit of point in time, uh, growing up during his childhood. Not for long, though, and ultimately spent a lot of time, I believe, in Mill Creek, Washington, if I'm not mistaken, before attending, or excuse me, I should say signing with the UCLA Bruins. Wasn't too active throughout his first 3 seasons there with the UCLA Bruins. He transfers in his senior season over to Montana and was very productive this past year, Blake. He was 52 total tackles, 17 tackles for loss. I look at that, Blake, that tells me, in 14 games, 52 tackles, 17 tackles for loss. A guy that's very active in the run game.
Mm.
He's not just kind of hanging his hat on sack productions and stuff like that. He is a guy that has a high motor, is very doesn't take plays off when it's a run play. He's given it all he can with, like I said, 52 tackles in 14 games, 17 tackles for loss, bringing down ball carriers in the backfield, etc. And also finished with 9.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and 2 fumble recoveries on this past season, Blake. So a very productive player. You could tell why he got the NFL attention, especially at his frame, 6'5", Blake, 255 pounds, a pretty long guy, pretty big frame on him as well with Hayden Harris. So very interested to see what
Yeah,
Hayden
and
Harris finds out. Go ahead, Blake.
qu- quickly, Cole, just before we move on to Jackson Finley, from all you're saying, probably quite a similar story to Christian Covington, who the Lions, of course, are going to have again this year. And you were saying earlier that, of course, Hayden Harris signed a NDFA free agent contract with the Buffalo Bills. That might be the best thing for him because we saw last year that it wasn't until kind of Labor Day, a little bit after, for Christian Covington to play, to get used to the Canadian game. Like he spent his whole career from literally Pee Wee football all the way up until his quite illustrious, if we're being honest, NFL career, 7, 8 years, not playing the Canadian game ever. So it took him quite a while to adjust to the Canadian game last year. But we saw when Christian Covington finally was able to adjust to the Canadian game, how much his production upticked.
I agree wholeheartedly with that one, Blake. So let's get to the man of the hour. Both you and I are big fans of Mr. Jackson Finley, as are the BC Lions organization. Ryan Rigmain was quoted as saying the best combine interview that he's done in his entire career with Jackson Finley. Of course, I mentioned it multiple times. We're big fans of Jackson Finley here on the Canadian Football Fanatics. We've been lucky enough to have him on our platform. Go check that out, of course, to get a little bit more of an idea of what Jackson Finley is, the player, the person. But Jackson Finley, Blake, I had stayed away from mocking Jackson Finley to the BC Lions because I have been so high on Jackson Finley. As you know, Blake, I put out my top 10 prospects going into the CFL draft. I had Jackson Finley in my top 5. I think a lot of people in the CFL circle, analysts, scouts, had Jackson Finley as a top 10 scout. I think the word kind of got out that some teams are a little bit concerned with his, which concern sounds like such a bad word when talking about he's a potentially going to be a doctor, and I believe standing in some cancer research where he's, I think, going to kind of work in some kids cancer research. I think teams are a little bit scared off with not knowing potentially how long his career might be, or kind of maybe his interest in playing a long career with, maybe potentially wanting to go back to school to finish his degree and continue to go down the path of being a doctor, which I would imagine will be his life career after football and stuff like that. So there's definitely some questions. That being said, Blake, on the field as a person, Jackson Finley is an absolute home run at pick 16. I think outside of, you know, a few picks, Taylor Elgersma is definitely one of them. I'm trying to think of some of the other guys that fell as well. Connor Shea, Winnipeg definitely got some good value with Connor Shea falling to 6, Elgersma at 18. Jackson Finley at 16 is up there for me as best value pick in the entire CFL draft this year. I think his combination of being a four-phase special teamer, as well as playing multiple positions. He not only plays safety for the Western Mustangs, I believe he can play and has the ability to play Sam linebacker, or nickel linebacker is what the BC Lions are calling it now, as well as being able to play boundary or field halfback at the CFL level. I'm curious to see what happens with, obviously, as we know, Blake, we're both high on Christophe Boyu as well. You and I were both up there last year at Kamloops, hearing people rave about Christophe Boyu at training camp. You and I were both ones that had kind of, or were a little bit familiar with him going into the CFL draft, with some of my prospects to watch and stuff like that, content going out before the draft, being high on him and the football player he was. He ends up coming to the BC Lions in the 3rd round, if I'm not mistaken, is kind of going back and forth with Adrian Green throughout the year, in and out of the starting lineup. Throughout the back half of the year, I think they kind of, this is the direction we're going to go in for the future. And people, again, with, their second selection in the CFL draft, were wanting maybe another player that's going to be a little bit more of an obvious pathway to get for him to get on the field. Where I would argue and kind of push back on people is, obviously it's going to be a little bit hard for Jackson Finley to crack the starting lineup. I think it is for all starting rookies, you could say, in the CFL, for them to crack the starting lineup. Where I would push back on folks is, I think this guy's going to be he's absolutely going to, if he stay healthy, he's going to play 18 games, and he's going to be, like I said, a 4-phase special teamer where he's going to play on punt return, kick, kickoff, and kick return. And I think he's going to be able to do it at a pretty high level, being a rookie. Now, year 2, 3, we'll talk about maybe getting the starting lineup then. Obviously, that's a little bit of a bummer when talking about your first 2 selections are kind of guys that are, Hayden Harris being a guy that's a see ya Labor Day guy, and Jackson Finley being a guy that's, see you on special teams, or maybe see you next year in the starting lineup kind of guy. I think maybe I'm looking at it as kind of a glass half full type thing, Blake, and maybe that's where we're going to see what happens come, when games are played, and what these guys turn into as pros. I just think Jackson Finley, man, is an absolute ball player. Like multiple people have said, talking about him on the field, you can almost speak as highly about him off the field with what he does in the community, his community work, his volunteering and stuff like that. Him coming back, being a BC boy, being a North Vancouver boy, went to Vancouver College. I would imagine that's going to be tenfold, where he's going to be doing his community work, volunteering. We're going to see him out in the community doing stuff, and I would imagine maybe Blake's. I know big rattlers with the Vancouver College and his high axe, so maybe not wanting to see too much of that Vancouver College purple, but you know, I feel like this is a phenomenal pick and phenomenal value with, like I mentioned, pick 16. I haven't mentioned as well, Blake. He is a fourth generational, yes, folks, a fourth generational CFL bloodline in the Finley family. His great great grandfather played in the CFL. His great great grandfather, his great grandfather played in the CFL. His grandfather played for the BC Lions. His uncle played for the BC Lions as well as the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and his dad also had a little bit of a stint in the CFL as well. So a fourth generation CFL Finley we have on our hands here. I am very excited to see this kid in camp. Like, I think it's going to be very similar to what we had with Christophe Beaulieu last year, who, there was a lot of people. Nick Kowalski was definitely one of them, of, being raving about him early. And then once he got on the field, it was like he kept making plays. We were up there for the training camp scrimmage, Blake, excuse me, and he was all over the field making plays. Uh, Pass breakups, tackles on special teams, you name it. He was all over the field. I'm very curious to see what happens to Jackson Finley. And if he gets I feel like if he starts making plays, like, we're gonna start to hear that same momentum of, man, this Jackson Finley kid. How are we gonna keep him on the field? Like, we got to find a place for him to start. So, Blake, I know you're a big fan of him as well, being a BC boy. Maybe not the Vancouver College part, but how happy were you to see Jackson Finley fall to us, and for the BC Lions, like you mentioned, to trade up 3 spots to go and get Jackson Finley?
Yeah, no, I was extremely happy to get Jackson Finley. I was shocked more than anything. Like, I did not expect at all Jackson Finley to be available to the BC Lions. So when I saw the Hayden Harris pick, I actually didn't see the Jackson Finley pick at first until you would kind of tweeted it out and whatever. And when I saw his name come across your timeline, I was very excited because I agree that he can be someone like Christophe Beaulieu from last season, who the Lions, at some point, they're just going to have to figure out a way to get him on the field. Like Christophe Beaulieu, like you already talked about, last year the Lions were forced to play their hand by Christophe Beaulieu. And for him to make that final roster, like, he just made too many plays at training camp during the preseason where they were like, there's no way we can cut this guy. Like, whether it's him playing special teams or not, we're forced kind of to have this guy on our team. And I expect very similar, if not the exact same result from Jackson Finley this upcoming training camp and Kamloops, and then the 2 preseason games.
We'll get into it a little bit on probably future episodes. Maybe we'll touch on it a little bit later, Blake. But I just think Jackson, as well as Christophe Beaulieu, I should also mention Patrice Renee's, the 3 Canadian safeties technically on the roster, their ability to also play multiple positions. Patrice Renee's already played Sam, or their nickel position was what their Ryan McMahon was quoted as saying now that they wanted to have it called. As well as I think more Jackson, more so than maybe Christophe and Patrice Renee could possibly play halfback. But the position flexibility where, if Christophe Beaulieu does start at safety, I really think that Jackson Finley could start at nickel or at Sam linebacker as well. So TBD, folks. Like I said, we'll maybe touch on that a little bit more, Blake. But before we get off the draft, because we are kind of it's cruising, Blake. I already forget how time flies in this, buddy, and only having an hour for Rogers TV, which, shout out to Rogers, has been airing some of our content. I believe this is going to be the first show that they're going to be airing of Blake and I's BC Lions content this season. I believe nothing is official quite yet. We're still in talks with Todd, the producer over here in the Nanaimo studio, of getting all of our content and videos, post-game previews from the BC Lions aired on Rogers TV. You guys can go actually to the Rogers TV website, type in Canadian Football Fanatics. You guys can find our TV schedule. Unfortunately for myself, I believe Blake as well, I'm actually not going to keep saying that, because go subscribe to Rogers is what you guys should do, and get off TELUS and any other TV subscribers. But go check it out, Canadian Football Fanatics, over there on their website. And you guys should be able to follow us all season long, covering the BC Lions as well. Blake and I will be back for our previews and post games throughout the season, Blake. So to cap off the BC Lions, the rest of the BC Lions draft class, they did not have a selection in the third round as well, Blake, and they took in the fourth round Connor Klassen, offensive lineman out of the Regina Rams. I want to say the Regina Thunder, because he is also a Regina Thunder alum as well. I have to get my CJFL shoutouts in there as well. Spent, I believe, 2 or 3 seasons with the Regina Thunder, developing with them. Came over to the Regina Rams, spent a few seasons, and then this past season went on to win the Hardy Cup, went on their miracle run almost to a Cinderella storybook ending with the Vanier Cup finish with the Regina Rams. I think this is a guy that's going to be an interesting one to see. I would love to see him, mostly played offensive tackle, Blake, at Regina, and well, with both Reginas, I guess I could easily say. I think he transitions into better playing offensive guard personally. Now, where they have him slotted at training camp is one thing. I'm interested to see if this guy makes the roster. There's a lot of names already in the offensive line room. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe this is a guy that they look to potentially stash away on the practice roster, Blake, and they see some potential with this guy, to stick around the team this year. Injuries do happen. Maybe he has to come into the lineup at some point, and maybe they can develop him into something, or maybe he can at least develop into some competition for next year's training camp battles as well. Another guy, I should go in order here, but round 5, pick 41, they selected Drew Dorian, offensive lineman out of Kansas. In the 6th round, pick number 50, they selected linebacker out of University of Alberta, Chase Tatterin. In the 7th round, pick 59, they selected another guy I was high on. He was actually on my top 10 prospects, top 10 biggest sleeper prospects going into the CFL draft, Blake. Alex Berwick, offensive lineman out of Western. More of a center than anything. Played mostly center at the University of Western. Was a part of arguably the best running game in the country and in all of university sports in Canada here. Western's talked about as, up there, if not the best when it comes to running the football. I think that's kind of the identity that the BC Lions want to have this year, with bringing over Buck Pierce, obviously bringing back James Butler, and looking to go in that direction a little bit more. I'm curious to see if Alex Berwick's able to, maybe push as, a depth option. Like I said, maybe kind of more leaning towards a practice roster spot more than anything. And then the guy that I think is an interesting one with their last selection, Blake, Luka Stoikos, fullback out of University of Toronto, potentially a short yardage option and or some competition for Riley Pickett, as well as Dylan St. Pierre. So I'm curious to see what happens. But Blake, that was the BC Lions draft class. I am very excited to see how those first 2 picks pan out, because I do think, no slight at Hayden Harris, I don't want this to sound like a slight, but I do think he is more than likely a CFL type player. And I do think those guys are going to be pretty high impact players for the BC Lions eventually. Whether that's, Labor Day next season, I think we will find that out later on, Blake. So, Blake, to put a bow on the CFL draft, buddy, because we have some football that is almost here to talk about, actually, and no more ifs, ands, or buts. Let's get into the BC Lions training camp preview, Blake. And we're going to start with some position battles that are going to be taking place at training camp. Blake and I, last time we came on here, we talked about kind of similar, some position training camp battles as well. We had the depth chart up with us. We're not going to pull that up with us here tonight, Blake. I want to make some tweaks and stuff to that. We'll have that up on the next show with us to go over it, have a little bit more of a better idea of where guys are slotted in, Blake. But where I want to start, Blake, is in the offensive line room. I think this is a foreshadowing, maybe potentially, to something that we will talk about to end the show, Blake, and I will leave it at that. The offensive line room is where I want to start first, Blake, and I'm not too sure if fans or if yourself was able to listen to some of the media availabilities that Ryan Rigmain, Buck Pierce, Nathan Rourke, and Justin McInnes were able to provide for us. I was able to go back, listen to them once again before we hopped on here, Blake, and just pull some quotes for the viewers and fans here listening up for us tonight when talking about some of the battles here. I'm going to start with the right guard position, which was named specifically by Ryan Rigmain when he spoke with the media. I believe it was JC Abbott that asked him the questions of, what are some of the biggest position battles that you have your eyes on going into training camp. He specifically mentioned offensive line, specifically right guard and center, and the linebacker position, the Sam nickel, whatever we're going to call it. Forgive me, folks. I'm going to be calling it definitely both, being more familiar with Sam or nickel. Blake, maybe we could be a little bit more educational, Blake. Are you familiar with kind of like what Sam and nickel is, Blake, or should I maybe like give? Yeah, I'm gonna. So for folks that are maybe a little bit confused, because I had some comments one time going back through some videos of people that asked what is a will linebacker position, right? And a will linebacker, essentially, folks, I wish I kind of had the depth chart up. It would be a little bit easier to explain. But essentially, Blake, the boundary side of the field, Blake, would be the short side of the field for the offense, right? So the hash marks that are in the middle of the field, those white lines, right? Say the offense is closer to the left hash mark, Blake. That would mean the left side of the field would be the boundary side, which is just the short side of the field for the offense. Now, go to the defense. That would be the boundary side still. But on that side of the field would be the will linebacker, because more often than not, Blake, the offense is going to have two receivers into the boundary, and that's more than likely their two best receivers, right? So if, like, for us, it's more than likely going to be TBD more than likely, because Alex Hollins isn't there. Justin McInnes plays the field, so it's going to be more than likely kind of like Stanley Berryhill playing that boundary wide receiver, and then somebody else playing that slot position. So getting back to the will linebacker, the Sam linebacker, Blake, or the nickel linebacker, why he's called the strong side linebacker is because he's over top of the three receiver side of the offense, right? Where there's three receivers to the more open side of the field, right? Because you don't really want to have the three receivers into the boundary. There's less field to work with, right? So you want to have the three receivers more than likely out to the field side. So that Sam linebacker or nickel linebacker, he's kind of more responsible for that most inside receiver, more likely than not, right? And then obviously the middle linebacker, or the MLB middle linebacker, is fine as well, but most people call it the Mike linebacker, which is the middle linebacker. And then, like I mentioned, the Sam linebacker is the linebacker that is to the strong side of the field for the defense, and covers the third receiver more often than not. Also has the responsibility of being a linebacker as well, but also carries the same responsibilities as a defensive back as well. So that's why he's the strong linebacker, because he is to the strong side of the field, or excuse me, that's why he's the Sam linebacker, because he's he's to the strong side of the field, is what I should say. So just for those people that are wondering, 'cause sometimes I do use that terminology and people aren't familiar with it. So, and like I said, I do remember seeing a comment for people asking. So, like I said, folks, no bad questions on here. Feel free to leave a comment down below. Let us know if anything's kind of confusing when it comes to terminology, anything like that. Feel free to let us know, and it would be, my pleasure to kind of, stop and have a little bit of we can maybe call it a little bit of a chalk talk, if you will, and we can kind of explain a little bit better. So, getting back, excuse me, folks, kind of that's why Shane said Cole jumping all over the place like a jackrabbit last night. We're gonna jump back, Blake, to the offensive line position, and I'm gonna start, as I mentioned. Ryan Rigmain was made available to the media, and specifically name dropped the right guard position, Blake. And then before he was done talking about the offensive line, he also brought up the center position as well. And he was most notably he noted at the right guard position, George Unar, our last year's first round pick, is going to be given every chance to win the job, was in quotes, at right guard. Now, where he also mentioned who else is going to be in that competition is going to be David Foucault, veteran offensive lineman who we just brought over spent the past few seasons with the Edmonton Elks, a veteran in the CFL, a very serviceable offensive lineman. I don't think he is, a great offensive lineman. He's not a bad offensive lineman. He is a pretty solid offensive lineman, a very serviceable guy. Maybe you can kind of relate him to a little bit of like kind of a Chris Slugger kind of guy, right? Where he's a pretty good floor, but not the highest ceiling kind of guy. So at right guard, it looks as of now, George Una, like I mentioned, is going to give every chance to win that job. And David Foucault is going to be that other guy that's going to be in competition for that right guard position. But where I thought it was very interesting, Blake, and you and I have had this conversation multiple times. I thought the BC Lions should have walked away from Couture this offseason. He was not shy about mentioning that is a position battle at center between Mike Couture, Andrew Pearson, and Tyler Packer. Now, I thought it was a very interesting one for Andrew Pearson, kind of almost somewhat taking him out of that right guard competition. I think he should have been in the running for that as well. Now, obviously, his versatility, I think, Blake, is going to keep him on the roster, because I think if he doesn't win that that center position, Andrew Pearson's your sixth offensive lineman. You could write it in Sharpie, folks. I would almost tell you it's a guarantee. There's no guarantees in life, but Andrew Pearson, his ability to play all three interior offensive line positions, he is an absolute locker room glue guy. He's a very important piece into that locker room, especially with the faces and pieces they've lost this offseason. I would think that's going to be an important face to keep around. He is also one of the longest tenured BC Lions now that's on the roster, Blake. So I would, like I said, if he doesn't win that starting center position, I would put it in Sharpie almost. Andrew Pearson is going to be on this team in some way, shape, or form. Where I think it's interesting, Blake, is Tyler Packer and his ability to potentially start at center over one Mike Couture, who I think took a step back last year, was one of the more higher paid offensive linemen last year. He falls out of the top 15 highest paid offensive linemen this year. The BC Lions signed into a little bit more of a friendlier deal, I believe. And now he comes into camp with no guarantee. And where I will remind folks now, Blake, as we're kind of getting into some of these position battles, where some of the older regime, now it's a little bit different, right? But with some of the older regime already being in-house still, with Neil McAvoy still being on staff, sometimes when teams get flipped over with new GMs, right, Ryan McMahon doesn't necessarily have the same loyalty to a guy that he already brought in that's one of his guys, right? So I'm curious to see what happens to, a guy like Mike Couture, where, that's not necessarily his guy that he brought in, right? That's a guy that Neil McAvoy brought in when he was GM, right? So maybe Ryan McMahon's like, this isn't necessarily my guy that I brought in. We don't have to keep him on the roster if they want to go in a different direction. I'm very curious to see what happens there. Now, where I would kind of my eyebrow raised, Blake, is that there was no mention of a competition at left guard at all. And like I mentioned about Andrew Pearson being able to play all three interior offensive line positions, we already have Chris Slugger, who's already on the roster, who played serviceable games for us last year, as well as Corey Woodruff, who was the same, a guy that played serviceable minutes for us, started some games for us last year. I believe started that Touchdown Pacific game where things started to look in the right direction. We kind of maybe hit a peak, and then we kind of crashed, unfortunately, after that point. But I would imagine as of now that left guard position battle, Blake, is going to be between Chris Slugger and Corey Woodruff. And, it's going to be an interesting one because there's all sorts of competition. There's there's nobody that's for sure starting on the offensive line in the interior as of now. Like I mentioned, the only one that kind of I feel safe naming on the roster is Andrew Pearson. And that's not in the starting capacity. So I'm curious to see what happens there. But Blake, when talking about the interior offensive line and their battles, Blake, is there any kind of battles that maybe stick out to you when it comes to center, right guard, and left guard?
Yeah, I think that center battle that you mentioned is kind of the one that sticks out most to me. More so just because, like, as Ryan Brigmaden already said, there's going to be three guys battling for one spot and not just two, like the other positions. So that's the one that I'm most looking forward to seeing. And that's also the one that is probably arguably the most important position on the offensive line, because not only are you blocking, but you're quite literally hiking the ball in most cases, especially in the Canadian Football League, where almost all plays are from the shotgun. You're the one that's hiking the ball to the quarterback. So at center, if your snap is off, it throws off the entire play. And more often than not, the play dies before it even generally starts.
Yeah, Blake, that's a good point by you, buddy, talking about the snap as well being a very pivotal point of playing center, right? And making sure that that's as accurate as possible as it's a tough thing. Like having experience being a quarterback, you want it nice and you want it to be nice and firm, but you don't want it to be a fastball, right? You got to have kind of that sweet spot of like nice and fast, but also not don't fire it back at me. I'm just right behind you, right? So it's kind of that being able to have a I don't want to say like workable, but a very um a user-friendly, I guess, snap where the quarterback's able to not even kind of second guess. It's coming into his stomach area. He's able to get the ball and not even have to look where it's going. He's able to, start reading the defense and stuff like that. So, very good point by you, Blake, to finish the offensive line talk out. I will add one more thing when it comes to offensive line camp battles, Blake. I will be very interested. Obviously, we are pretty shored up at offensive tackle as of now, with left tackle being Jarrell Broxton, a CFL All-Star caliber offensive lineman, as well as Dejon Allen, a most outstanding offensive lineman caliber offensive lineman playing right tackle. As I mentioned to Blake, injuries happen throughout a season, man. I
Yeah,
am very
injuries
curious
happen.
I'm very curious to see what happens with the depth at offensive tackle there, because there's going to be someone that's kept on the roster, whether that's the practice roster or at some capacity. Like I mentioned, could that be a guy like Connor Klassen, who's shows enough? I don't know if he's technically sound enough to play that offensive tackle position. Like I said, I see him more of as an offensive guard. But is that a guy like Connor Klassen who comes in, shows some promise, maybe they keep him on the practice roster, and break glass in case of emergency? Connor Klassen maybe is that extra offensive tackle. I would imagine they would lean more than likely towards a American depth option at offensive tackle, having two Americans starting for you already, and not wanting to mess with the ratio, having three guys more than likely being Canadian start in the interior, or I guess two actually, with that left guard not being Canadian potentially. So I'm very interested to see what happens with the depth at offensive tackle as well, because as I mentioned, Blake, it is a long season, buddy, and 18 games. There's no guarantees that all five offensive linemen stay healthy and are going to be available for us. And even for for our sakes, Blake, we're hoping for 21 games is what we're hoping for, or maybe
20,
even 20.
20. Yeah.
20, yes, 20. So, it's a long year, and those guys take a absolute pounding up front. So the more the better, the more the merrier, I guess is the saying, and we will see how that position battle pans out. Blake, my next biggest position battle is actually on the opposite side of the ball, and is that linebacker. And we talked about it, Blake, already.
I
That
figured you were gonna go there, but go on.
Yeah, at linebacker, the biggest one is at Sam or the nickel position. But I will remind folks, and this is, I guess, a good opportunity to talk about the linebacking room as a whole. Ryan Rigmain was quoted as saying that Josh Woods is not going to be ready for the start of the season. It sounds like he's going to be up in Kamloops for training camp. He's not going to be able to take part in the start of training camp, which I would mean kind of signals to him not being ready for the start of the season. At some point in the year, I would imagine he's going to be ready. I think he mentioned it's just under a year for the timeline of when he tore it. I believe he tore it in week number 2 or 3 versus Edmonton Elks at home. So it's around kind of just in the ballpark of about a year. He also mentioned that Adam O'Clair, linebacker, is going to be missing the start of training camp with a shoulder injury. So that kind of shuffles things around a little bit in the linebacker room. But I'm going to start. Let's start left to right, Blake. We're going to start with that will linebacker, which kind of also leaks into the Mike or the middle linebacker as well. But the biggest question I think in the linebacker room is, where are Micah Awe and Ben Hladek going to start for us? Because both have familiarity and have played both positions, will linebacker as well as Mike linebacker. So it's going to be very interesting to see. Ryan Rigmain didn't really give any indication. He was very happy to mention that both have played Mike and Will when he was asked the question, but didn't really give any cues to who was going to start at Mike, who was going to start at Will. He did mention, however, he was high on the rookies, or excuse me, he said, I feel very, very good about the rookies in the linebacker room, talking about Mike Smith, a guy that had also been mentioned by the First and Now guys, Kowalski and Baker, as well as Devin Richardson, another rookie linebacker. And where I think this is going to be interesting, Blake, because he mentioned that the Sam position, he said, quote, like, or probably the way that we're built, we're going to start a rookie at that position, talking about Sam or nickel. He talked about Tyler Coyle potentially being a front runner at that Sam linebacker position, a rookie to the CFL. And as I mentioned, him being high on Mike Smith, Devin Richardson, Blake, where does Ryan McMahon cut his teeth as a general manager, as a scout in the U.S. development? In the U.S. is where he was kind of the Lions guy, right? Where, we have a Canadian regional scout. We have we have Neil McAvoy, who's more familiar with the Canadian game. And then we had Ryan McMahon, who did his due diligence scouting all over America, finding guys, going to different camps. He was the guy that was at the BC Lions camps in the United States, where, he's kind of signing off on some of these guys where, hey, I think this is a BC Lion type of guy. Let's try to get this guy in for a contract and see what happens down the road. I'm going to be very interested to see what happens with some of these first year guys that Ryan McMahon is probably very high on. They're going to be, like I mentioned earlier, his guys. As we said about, guys like Mike Couture, who are more than likely Neil McAvoy guys, right? And we kind of seen that a little bit with a guy like Alex Hollins, Blake, not to get all over the place like a jackrabbit again, but we're essentially paying Alex Hollins a minimum type contract, even more than a minimum type contract. We're paying him $75,000 to play for the Edmonton Elks right now. Whether, Rigmain mentioned that it was the medicals that they couldn't, it was the contract and the medicals that they couldn't get eye to eye on, kind of made them a little bit far apart. But like I mentioned, Ryan McMahon, that was a Neil McAvoy guy right there that was brought in by Alex Hollins, brought in by Neil McAvoy. He Ryan McMahon doesn't necessarily have any ties to them long term, and can kind of look towards his ability as a scout and trust that he can go find somebody that's going to be able to come in to the CFL, as we see every year. First year CFL guys come in, contribute, and turn into household names, or if not all-star type names in the CFL. I'm going to be very curious to keep an eye on some of those guys as well. But like I mentioned, high on those guys, Mike Smith, Devin Richardson, to play the Mike linebacker position. Now, where I will pause Ron Rigman, I think that was a little bit more for maybe not play, but Haladic and Alway are your two. Haladic and Alway, whether they're Mike, whether they're Will, are going to be your two day one starters. Like I mentioned about offensive line, injuries do happen. Haladic was coming off a pretty banged up 2024 where he was, in and out of the starting lineup. And I would imagine that he was probably a little bit more banged up than he let on with trying to get back in the lineup because of Josh Woods being out for the year. Ben Haladic probably trying to rush into the lineup a little bit more, probably played a little bit more than we knew last year, banged up due to injury. So who knows what happens? But as of day one, it'll be Micah Alway and Ben Haladic. Mike Smith and Devin Richardson are names to be pay attention to. But as of now, I believe the word on the street, Blake, or the word that we're hearing is that Tyler Coyle is going to be the front runner to play that nickel linebacker position, a guy that has to be a linebacker by trade, but also has to be a coverage player, has to cover that inside slot position. I will say, I don't know if they're going to be in the running, but I will throw their names into the hat just for the sake. I don't know if I have any say, Blake, but Patrice Renee and Jackson Finley, folks, do not forget about their names at nickel linebacker position. I think those guys could both play at a high level. Patrice Renee played that position for us a little bit for over the last few years. And Jackson Finley, like I said, folks, is an absolute dog. Wherever you put him on the field, I think he can play nickel as well. Do not forget about those names. So, Blake, what I guess sticks out to you, or what kind of maybe is kind of interesting to you when talking about the linebacker position and some of those names in the room?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie to you, Cole. Obviously, Micah Alway from his time previously with the Lions, most recently with the Calgary Stampeders. He's a name that I know of. Same with Ben Haladic. The other three names I have no familiarity with at all. Like I couldn't even tell you who they were if I was walking next to them on the street. So that's why I'm glad that you do the heavy lifting, if you will, on our show more times than not. Um, but yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to see, and I'm glad that you mentioned the name Jackson Finley as well, because like we talked about after the draft, he's someone that I don't think you can count out. It's he's going to be like we already mentioned, he's going to be very similar to Christoph Beaulieu last year, where he's going to show up to rookie camp, he's going to make plays. They're going to be like, hey, maybe this is a guy we kind of need to keep an eye on during main camp. And then once main camp hits, it's going to be like, no, we have to find a way to keep this guy on our roster. Like, there's absolutely no way where he can be stashed on the practice roster, because let's not forget, Cole, that if a name is on the practice roster, they can be claimed by any of the 8 other teams in the CFL. If they have a need for their team, they can just pluck them right off the practice roster and insert them right into the starting lineup. So I know the BC Lions know that as well, and I know they're going to be aware of that, and they're going to be forced by Jackson Finley to find a spot on their final 53-man roster for him.
Yeah, for sure. Blake, before we get into some of our excitement and concerns for the BC Lions to close out the episode, I will just mention quickly a few other position battles to keep an eye on, folks, as training camp kicks off, and something that Blake and I will definitely touch on our next episode a little bit longer, because not want to go too long here. But some other just questions looking at the camp battles per se, but who will step up opposite of Matthew Betts? As I mentioned, why wanting to draft Hayden Harris, to have a Robin to Batman, to have somebody opposite of Matthew Betts. Now we're kind of, Hayden Harris is a UDFA. He's going to be with the Buffalo Bills till at least August, if not longer. Sione Tama, 6-game suspension list. After that, it's a lot of unproven names on the roster. As I mentioned about Ryan Rigbane's ability to scout, maybe he's high on some first-year guys to come up and maybe potentially grab one of those spots. But outside of that, you're looking at guys like Giuliano Felinaco and some of those depth options that we had rotating in last year that, are depth options. They're depth options for a reason, right? They're, good pros. They're pros for a reason, right? But they're, compared to the best, or compared to the, we're trying to win the West. We're trying to win the Grey Cup. Can they get that done? I think that's a little bit of a question mark there for sure. I do wonder whether or not maybe Christian Covington. Maybe it's not a guy that's opposite of Betts. Maybe it's a guy that's right next to Matthew Betts. Of, you know what, we can't block either one of them, and we have them both on the same side, right? Maybe that's the thing, right? Where you mentioned, Blake, Covington played American football for a majority of his football career, and he comes to the CFL. It's not really the start we're kind of hoping for. We're both very critical of him. After Labor Day, man, he was absolutely dynamite for the BC Lions in the interior. I think we're both kind of expecting another jump from Christian Covington this upcoming season, for him to kind of get, his feet wet a little bit more. He's in Vancouver for a full off season, and we see him doing the CFL media and stuff like that. He's very comfortable around the league and stuff like that now. Maybe it's a guy like Christian Covington who steps up opposite Matthew Betts in the interior there. So looking further down the defensive uh, roster, the halfback position is going to be an interesting one, with guys like, Ronald Kent, Deontay Williams, a few of those guys that we acquired in free agency, probably more than likely going to be slotting into the starting lineup at the halfback position as well. Obviously, Blake, it appears like we're going to be without TJ Lee playing halfback for the first time in a long, long time in a BC Lions uniform, which is going to be a little bit different. Who's going to fill that boundary halfback position? We will find out very soon. That's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on. Fifth wide receiver, Blake, to go over to the offense, right? Stanley Berryhill is probably that guy that's penciled in as of now, but I would say that's penciled in for sure, right? Where you look at a guy like Justin McInnis, Javon Catoy, Keelan Hatcher, Aiden Eberhardt. Those are our 4 wide receivers for sure. You put him in Sharpie. Stanley Berryhill, I think, is pretty close to being a for sure starter guy. But a guy, guys that they've already had in that I think they're pretty high on. Hayden Hatton, he's been out with Nathan Rourke and Rob Williams and all the guys that are throwing in Vancouver and stuff like that. And I think that's going to be a guy to keep an eye on for fans. That a guy that people are probably like, who? Hayden who? Hayden Hatton who? Absolutely, folks. I felt the same way when kind of researching about him. He's a first-year guy coming in the CFL, but a guy that's been running, putting in the time in with Nathan Rourke to, I feel like, hit the ground running when it comes to training camp, having those reps already under his belt. Another guy, Lynn Bowden Jr., with NFL experience, a pretty dynamic player with the ball in his hands. I think another guy that could push to play that fifth wide receiver position, as well as maybe guys like Braden Lenius, some other Canadians potentially, with already having Canadians in the starting lineup. I think that's going to be a little bit more of a difficult one, but keep an eye on some of those names, folks. It will be interesting as well. And of course, Blake, I think another one to keep an eye on with Buck Pierce coming over, and I think the focal point to run the football a little bit more, backup running back behind James Butler. I think James Butler, keeping him as fresh as possible for the playoffs, is one of the highest keys for the BC Lions coming into the season. Having a reliable depth option at running back, a guy that you can trust to say, you know what, if JB's banged up for, a month, say he's, he pulled a hammy or something like that, we can sit him down, we can make sure we rest him completely, get him healthy for the playoffs, and we trust our backup running back to come in, give us some serviceable reps, and not miss a beat by there. I know there's a lot of guys coming into camp at that running back position. I think they're trying to take a look at somebody that's going to be able to come in and roster and be that depth option at running back. So, Blake, to close out our episode, buddy, I sent you what gives you confidence as a BC Lions fan going into the season. Feel free, folks, if you guys are watching the episode here, comment down below what gives you guys some confidence going into this season as a BC Lions fan. And then we're going to flip it to end the show. What concerns you going into the BC Lions fan, which is, oh boy. But Blake, I'm going to pass the floor over to you, buddy. What excites you and what concerns you?
Yeah, where do I want to go with this? I think I want to say what excites me first of all, and that's the fact that and like this might seem Captain Obvious take, but like the BC Lions have Nathan Rourke as their QB1. And it's like there's no question this year. Like it's not, is VA gonna start? Is Nathan gonna start? No, Nathan is the QB1. Nathan knows. I bet Nathan is the first guy to admit that when he came in last year, he did not play at his best. He didn't play anywhere close. He was probably like, I would argue that going back to his high school, college days, that might be the worst that Nathan has played. And that's not to say that like Nathan was like throwing interceptions left and right, and he was the reason the Lions stumbled out like towards the end of the year and lost in the West semifinal. But the drama and everything that was caused when Nathan, and of course inadvertently, but when Nathan came in and VA was hurt and the rest of the season went down, that's not going to happen this year. Like, is Nathan going to put up his 2022 numbers? Probably not. Is any quarterback going to put up Nathan's 2022 numbers before he got hurt? No, probably not. I think with a full off season, he knows where he's gonna go. I even said this on the 13th Man slash CFF Weekly show that I did with Shane and Coach Phil last night. I think that Nathan doesn't have to worry about the NFL anymore. I think he kind of realizes that at this point, it's kind of, and it's unfortunate for Nathan, but it's kind of a pipe dream. He knows that he's going to be in BC for the next little while, and he is going to be a better quarterback for it. He is going to be, I would argue, he is going to be very, very close to that MOP conversation. And that reason alone gives me the most confidence in the BC Lions this upcoming season. But to kind of take it back before I let
But
you go, Cole, or do you want to
Blake,
go for,
if yeah, you might as well save your concern, Blake, because
okay?
as you know, Blake, this topic gets me pretty fired the F up, Blake. This was also where I was going to go, Blake. And as you can already tell, I'm sure, already a little fired up by this topic, just to be completely honest with you. I am going to be 100% honest. I have so many Nathan Rourke receipts. I am waiting to cash on a lot of people after this season, to be completely honest. And whether that ends in a Grey Cup or not, I don't give a care. Because personally, whether it's a hot take or not, Nathan Rourke's the best quarterback in the CFL. The only names I want to hear it's even in the conversation, and this is no slight at one of the names I'm going to leave out because I think he's a great quarterback. I think he's a great person. The only names I want to hear are Zach Collaros and Bo Levi Mitchell. And for the only sake of just longevity and what their resume says, is the only kind of reasoning of I will listen to your conversation. Now I will say Vernon Adams deserves to probably be in that conversation as best quarterback in the CFL. Absolutely agree with that. Or maybe I should have included that. Nathan Rourke was arguably having the best CFL season by a quarterback ever, ever, point blank, period, ever on pace for. Now, where I think people need to caution, and you said it perfectly, Blake, will we ever see that again, Nathan Rourke? Most likely not. And that is incredible to think about. He was on pace for 6,000 yards passing, which we've seen once in pro football. In pro football, the NFL included, pro football, NFL, CFL, on pace for 6,000 passing yards. He was on pace for a historic season. So tempering expectations is something that people need to get accustomed to, or need to get need to digest a little bit more, because when Nathan Rourke doesn't throw for 400 yards and what he was doing in 2022, and they're like, I told you so, he's not Jesus himself. No kidding. No shit, Tips. Not to kind of swear here, but like, thanks, Captain Obvious. Like, I'm getting flustered here, Blake, but like, the fact that he is Canadian and people like tried to like discredit what he's doing, man, is unbelievably kind of is somewhat what holds the CFL back. To be completely honest, he's one of our own, and he is doing it at a very high level. I don't think we're ever going to see him get to that level again. I think he's going to be a 4,500 yard passer with 35, 40 touchdowns, which is a fabulous season. Going to be in contention for the MLP. Now, do the Lions have enough wins for him to be an MLP? I think is another conversation, and that's a conversation I will definitely have. But the people that are like burying this guy online, it has been a long offseason, Blake, a long offseason of like watching a lot of crazy takes, which is like, I think the best part of like podcasting and stuff like this is that people have different opinions, and that's what makes us human, which is that's what's great. Debate is awesome. That's why I kind of started this podcast, to have different opinions and see different aspects, to see different. Maybe I'm looking at it from maybe a Nathan Rourke fan perspective more so than a analyst perspective, which I don't think I am. But the amount of people that are ready to call this guy a bum and to call this guy like he's not even CFL caliber is unbelievable to me. Number one,
Insanity
to me. I am so flippin' excited to watch this season, Blake, because I know as of you, and I know that I know Zach Collaros is working. I know Bo Levi. I know Vernon Adams is working. You and I both know that he's doing he's having the Calgary Stampeders receivers to his home in Washington. He's going to meet with the first overall pick, Damien Elford. We already saw that on social media.
Yep.
Nathan Rourke. Almost every day we see that guy throwing with Rob Williams. He's working with the receivers. He had his own little mini camp with the receivers. He's, like I mentioned, with Rob Williams and getting his form and stuff like that working. I am so flipping excited, Blake, to cash a lot of receipts on a lot of dumb people. I'm sorry to say dumb people, but I am so excited to cash a lot of receipts that I have saved in my bookmarks of people just saying some craziness about Nathan Rourke. I'm going to leave it at that before we get a little bit too long and probably a little bit too winded, Blake. Let's get to something that makes us a little bit concerned, Blake. And maybe I'll go before you because I'm curious to see where you go, Blake. But I'm going to go the biggest concern, I think, for the last 5 years, since Mike Riley, I think, probably, which is not only the offensive line, but I would say the trenches as a whole. I would say the offensive line probably gives me the most concern, but the defensive line, I would say, gives me a pause for concern, where I'm very happy with guys like Matthew Betts, Christian Covington, but as I've said multiple times, Blake, it is a long season. Injuries are 100% guarantee in professional football. What happens when we saw it last year? What happens when a guy like Pete Robertson goes out of the starting lineup and we start to have depth options come in and we start to lose interior guys as well? The defensive line production starts to take a little bit of a step back, right? And what happens if we lose a guy? What happens if Shion Kemba is suspended for 6 games and Matthew Betts gets hurt in training camp or something like that? God forbid. I'm obviously not hoping for that to happen, but stuff like this happens all the time. Josh Woods out for the year, week 2. Reggie Stubblefield out for the year, week 1, I believe, or something like that, right?
Week 1
All
last year for the Alouettes.
all all-star caliber guys, great players in the league. It's just the nature of the business. I do not wish for it. I don't think Blake does. I speak for Blake. It's just a part of the game, unfortunately. It's the brutal part of the game. It's very unfortunate, and it's they say it's 100% injury rate when it comes to pro football. Whether you like it or not, or whether you can fight through it or not, is one thing. Um, I'm going to be interested to see what happens. Even later in the year when guys are playing through banged up, can we still have that production along the defensive line? I think if Christian Covington and Matthew Betts are in there, they're going to be able to have that trickle effect where those guys are going to be able to get their production, Matthew Betts and Christian Covington, with that trickle effect down the lineup where those other two defensive linemen are going to be one-on-one all day long, right? Where, you know, maybe the offensive lineman wins for, say, 50 reps of the game. All you need to do as defensive lineman is, get a sack for one snap of the game, and that looks like a good game, right? It's crazy to think from a offensive lineman perspective, if you give up one sack a game, that's maybe a bad game. Where a defensive lineman, if you get home just one game, you get blocked for their 60 snaps or whatever happened. Most people look at the stat sheet and be like, that defensive lineman got a sack. He must have had a good game, right? Where it's, a little bit of a different story potentially. So I think that trickle effect will work. It's whether or not the injuries kind of happen or not. The offensive line, Blake, I like a lot of the names on paper, but if we're being honest, Blake, we have the potential to basically start the same offensive lineman that we started last year with, Chris Slugger being left guard or Corey Woodruff, Mike Couture, and then David Foucault would be the kind of new body, and or George Una for once Suk Chung not being in the lineup. But you look at Jarrell Broxton, he's going to be the left tackle again. Dejon Allen is definitely the guy that I think lifts the floor of the BC Lions offensive line. I don't know if he creates a higher ceiling for them going forward, but I think the questions are still out on that offensive line, or whether or not that those problems were fixed. I think that's where a lot of people wanted to see the BC Lions potentially go after an offensive lineman with their first pick in that second round in the CFL draft. And that being said, folks, CFL draft is a crapshoot, right? It's like throwing darts on a dartboard where you're hoping to get a bullseye, but you're not. That's a small little bullseye that you're hitting. Kind of brings me back to, it's going to be interesting to see what happens for the offensive lineman there, Blake. But what is your biggest concern for the BC Lions, Blake, before we get out of here?
Yeah, my biggest concern for the BC Lions is probably the defense. Like we talked about it in our positional battles, how many positions, if you will, are kind of up for grabs to start the season. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like those guys, we see it in the CFL all the time. Like before last year, let's be completely honest. How many people knew about Roland Million? Like not a lot, unless you were in Saskatchewan. So we see it all the time that people come to the CFL and they have great seasons, but that defense in general scares me. And I would argue that just like I talked about and what gives me confidence in the BC Lions, that Nathan Rourke wasn't as bad as the season that he had or the half season when he came back last year. Unfortunately, I would tend to side with the defense was just as much to blame as the late season struggles as the offense. The defense was giving up way too many yards, way too many points. That Hamilton game, like that was, I would argue that's the turning point of last season. The Lions are up, what was it, like 24-0 at halftime? They end up giving up quite a few second half points. They're able to force it to overtime. But again, after kicking a field goal in overtime, where if your defense gets a stop, gets an interception, whatever, even holds the other team to a field goal to extend the game, maybe you get a bit of momentum. The defense gives up a touchdown, the Lions lose the game. And of course, we know what happened the rest of the season. So I'm really interested to see how the defense responds this year, what those position battles look like. And I'm excited to get the season going. Like we're less than 2 weeks away. That game in Victoria is the first official preseason game, May 19th. And then June 5th is the official kickoff of a new CFL season.
Well said there, Blake. And just to get back to a positive form, Blake and I talking about our concerns. Blake and I are both confident in the BC Lions because we
Yep.
have Nathan Rourke at quarterback. That is what we were talking about before getting into our concerns. Kind of not mentioning that, or kind of before we got to it, kind of getting a little bit of a rant out. But Blake, hour 10, buddy, as always, going a little over time, talking some Canadian football, just kind of the huge, I guess, on the Canadian Football Fanatics, but enjoyed talking some football, buddy. Oh, this makes me so excited of you and
I'm
I back.
so happy that we made it to May. Like we, we don't have to. I know we're late as it is, so the hockey season wasn't what it was supposed to be. I am ready for that ball to be kicked off, man.
You and I back in the saddle, back again talking Canadian football, back again talking BC Lions, man. I'm really excited, Blake. It's gonna be a fun year. Blake and I covering the BC Lions, bigger, better than ever before. Obviously, if you guys have been following along for the past few years, we've been doing a good job. But Blake and I are trying to take things to the next level this upcoming year. So please be sure to follow along. Please be sure to leave a like, comment down below. Like I said, what's your guys' biggest positive, or what's your biggest why you guys the most confident in the BC Lions? Let us know when you guys are concerned about the BC Lions going into this season. And of course, most importantly, I saw Blake already beat me to it. Smash the subscribe button. It would be greatly appreciated if you guys subscribe to the channel, help us push to 400 subscribers on the channel. Blake and I will be back again in a few weeks, folks. We will probably be back around maybe that game in Victoria. I would probably say more than likely after that. Of course, I'll be doing some content down there, but I would think Blake and I are probably going to be back again before that Calgary preseason game. We'll talk kind of a little bit of a prediction, like I mentioned. And then after that Calgary Stampeders preseason game, Blake and I are back that following week for a season preview officially dropping. And then, of course, we'll get into our regular schedule program where you guys will see us on a weekly basis. I can't believe it, Blake. And of course,
Here.
go check Blake and the boys and the fellas. I'll be there as much as I can this season. Officially transitioned over to the 13th Man Football page. They kicked off things last night. Excuse me, last night? 2 nights ago. Or
Last
last
night.
night.
Last
Last
night.
night.
Well, 2 nights ago when this drops, but yeah.
Yes, 2 nights ago when this drops. The boys kicked off. There are essentially the same weekly show. It's the Canadian
Yep.
Football Fanatics Times 13th Man Football show. That's going to be over on 13th Man Football YouTube page this year. As mentioned before, just
Spotify as
with
well.
yes, Spotify as well. Just with, like I mentioned, the work load I'm taking on this year, going to have to take a little bit of a step back. But that is why I have my co-pilot, my shotgun rider right beside me, Blake, to step up when I am a little bit too busy, and Blake's going to be contributing on there on a weekly basis. I know Blake's going to be a little bit busy too, so if we have to kind of rotate, so be it. And then Blake and I again, like I said, you'll see Blake and I's face. You'll see Blake's face maybe more than I on a weekly basis. So look out for that. But Blake, I had so much fun getting back in here, buddy, talking some football with you. I myself gonna get a quick bite to eat in me, Blake, and I am off to men's league football, which I am very excited about. Got some flag here tonight, Blake. We're currently the Toads. I'm on the Toads, Blake. That's our team name.
Ooh, the
We're
Toads.
3-0, Blake. We're 3-0.
Do you
We're
have
here. I'll
green
show you.
jerseys?
I'll show you. I'll show you, Blake. I'll show you. You can rate them. Oh, whoopsie! I almost knocked over the computer. You can rate them, Blake. Okay, we got two. We're that official, Blake.
Oh wow. Okay. Okay.
So we got these.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the white ones. I'm number 2 if people don't know. And Blake, we got these bad boys
Ooh.
as well. Orange. I wear
That,
my little BC Lions hat that's signed by Nathan Rourke, and it gives me a little bit of juice, Blake. I threw for a league record 7 touchdowns last week, Blake. So we're going
wow.
for
Okay. Okay.
8 maybe this week or something like
No,
that.
I want double digits.
Okay, we'll see what we can do, Blake. We'll see what we can do. But Anyways, folks, that'll do it for Blake and I for the BC Lions training camp preview. Thanks, guys, for tuning in, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.